that soon. So again, I'm going to go through the history quickly. If anyone wants to stop me, please feel free. But I think a really good place to start is really with the founding of Zionism. Or modern Zionism. And Theodor Herzl is considered the founder of modern Zionism. And essentially Zionism was a movement based on the idea to establish a new Jewish national homeland in the land known as Palestine, or historic Palestine. Now, the first real movement, or we could say, big action that happened to really help propel this movement was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was issued during World War I. Now, during World War I, you had a lot of dealing happening, especially with the British. You had the Balfour Declaration, you have the Sharif McMahon Correspondence, you also had Sykes-Picot. And a lot of these agreements actually, they contradicted each other, right? The British were making multiple promises. They made promises to the Arabs, they made promises to the Zionist movement in Britain, and then they also made promises to the French, right? And how they were going to divide up the Middle East after World War I. Now, after World War I ends, the British take over the British mandate over Palestine is issued. The League of Nations is formed, and then the League of Nations officially hands the British the mandate by 1922. Now, I know this slide is a little bit has a little bit of depth on it, but I just wanted you guys to really get a look at what was taking place on the back end during this time. So you have the end of World War I, and in 1919, Woodrow Wilson actually issues the King Crane, or formally puts in the King Crane Commission, and essentially he sends a team to the Middle East to see what are the aspirations of the Arabs in the Middle East. What do they want? Are they happy with the mandate system that's taken place? Do they want something else? And they went on multiple tours, interviews, they met with locals, and they found that the Arabs wanted self-determination as opposed to the mandate system that they were receiving at the time. This also fell in line with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. As many of you know, one of the 14 points is the call for self-determination by all countries. In 1930, you had the Shaw Commission. This found that the two most notable points of contention in this area were the landless class of discontented Arabs, as well as fears of increased Jewish immigration to the Palestinian territory. So during this time, you're seeing a lot of Jews begin to migrate to this area. And initially, the Palestinians in the region, or the Arabs in the region, they didn't see this as a threat until they started realizing that the idea of Zionism was to create this exclusively Jewish state in this land. So this is where you start to see the fears really develop amongst the indigenous population at the time. By 1936, you start to see an Arab revolt taking place. A lot of the Arabs in the region are starting to protest. And we have the Peel Commission, which is issued. And this recommended that the mandate be terminated and that two separate states be created, one for Jews and one for Arabs. Obviously, the Arabs denied this proposition, as the Palestinian National Movement at the time was actually calling for a single secular state that would be open to all the indigenous peoples at the time. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And then in 1939, the British issue the White Papers. This calls to reduce Jewish immigration to Palestine. It also rejected the partitioning of Palestine. And the Zionist movement actually responded with a lot of backlash due to this decision. This essentially was going to put their movement at a halt, and they were not happy with this. So you actually start to see a lot of the Zionist military groups in the region at the time, the Irgun, the Haganah, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Yes?
The White Papers coming out in between the Peel and the White. There was also, I believe, an Arab revolt in the mandate. How did that merge, especially since there were Jewish militias helping the British Empire at that time?
Say that one more time, the end of your question.
There was an Arab revolt in Palestine between 1936 and 39.
Yes.
I know that there were some Jewish militias, early basis for, as you mentioned, the Haganah. How were they involved, especially with the Zionists back in Europe conducting terrorism?
So I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. All right. So again, given that background, so actually we'll go right into that, right? You start to, so we'll start with David Ben-Gurion. You see the development of the labor Zionist movement, and this promoted a Jewish working class for essential national home. You also see the development of revisionist Zionism around this same time. It broadened the scope of the territorial claim from just the small portion or a small partition of the mandate Palestine, and they wanted Greater Transjordan to also be included into this Jewish state. And then this is where you start to see the Zionist militias start to really grow. The Irgun become one of the main revisionist military wings. They're considered a terrorist organization at the time, and they actually advocated for and carried out numerous attacks against not only Palestinians, but also the British. So this is where, to answer your question, you start to see these militias carrying out a lot of attacks actually against British and British outposts because of the white paper doctrine that was issued during the time. You also have the Lahai, which is another military group or break-off of the Irgun, and they were responsible for actually assassinating one of the British ministers, Lord Moyne. The Haganah is another group. Haganah stands for Defense. In 1948, this group would essentially become what is today the IDF, or Israeli Defense Forces. Now, in 1947, you have the end of World War II. Britain is no longer the power that it once was. So Britain actually defers the question of Palestine to the United Nations. Sykes-Picot, the imperialist countries, the French as well, all these countries are actually weakened after World War II. They're no longer the superpowers or the imperialist regimes that they could be. So they actually start to give the Arab states in the region their independence, slowly but surely. And by 1949, the British defer the question of Palestine to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations sends a delegation to Palestine for about 5 weeks, and they come up with the minority report and the majority report. The minority report calls for an end to the mandate. It wants to create a single federal state, with Jerusalem as its capital, and both Jews and Arabs would have autonomy in their respective areas. The majority report called for a partition mandate into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish, and Jerusalem would actually be internationalized. Now, obviously the majority report is what was considered accepted under the United Nations. They wanted to create 2 separate states, one Arab and one Jewish.
What is
internationalized? So essentially, Jerusalem wouldn't be controlled by either party. It would be under UN. The details were never really released, but it would be sort of a grouping of who would rule Jerusalem, right? So sort of internationalized in the sense that no single party would have control over it. It would, the United Nations or some sort of neutral force would be in place to administer Jerusalem. Yep. So the 1947 UN partition plan called for 51% of the mandate to go to a Jewish state, 49% of the mandate to go to an Arab state. By 1948, the British withdraw their forces from the mandate, and this is the same year that Israel declares its independence. Israel ends up declaring its independence on 78% of Mandate Palestine, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip are on the remaining 22%. Now, during this same time in 1948, the United Nations issues Resolution 194, which calls for any refugees that were expelled from their homes pre-48 to have the right to return to their homes. So in Israel's independence, many Palestinian villages, neighborhoods, a lot of Palestinians began to leave these neighborhoods as war was breaking out. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Today, a lot of those Palestinians are still on the outskirts of in refugee camps in Gaza Strip, the West Bank, as well as in Jordan and southern Lebanon. These Palestinians have not been able to return to their homes in what is considered Israel proper today from 1948. Now, just to give you guys a little background on what was happening on the Palestinian side during this same time. Again, prior to the creation of Israel, the Palestinian National Movement was actually calling for a single democratic secular state, which would include the various ethnic and religious communities in Palestine. Keep in mind, before the creation of Israel, there was actually Muslims, Jews, and Christians all living in this land. It wasn't until the first European Jews began to come to Palestine. The Jews prior to the first European Jews coming to Palestine considered themselves Arabs. They were Arab Jews, so they didn't see themselves as a distinct ethnic background. Rather, it was a religious one. Until the immigrants from Europe, Jewish immigrants from Europe began to come, they started to see Judaism as a distinct ethnicity. So this was a new development. Rather than just a religion, they also saw it as an ethnic makeup. By 1959, Yasser Arafat creates the political party Fatah in Kuwait. By 1964, the PLO is created by the Arab League, largely led by Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. And then by 1969, Fatah takes over the PLO with Arafat as its leader. All right, and then in 1967, we have a big event also happen. This is considered the Six-Day War. Israel preemptively attacks Egypt. A lot of Cold War politics play in during this time as well. I don't want to get into the details because that'll kind of deflect from the talk. However, Egypt began mobilizing its troops due to, some say, what was just bad intelligence from the Soviet Union. Others will argue that the major power, Soviet Union, was trying to instigate a war between Israel and the Arabs. But essentially, the Soviet Union, I don't believe in that position. Essentially, the Soviet Union gave bad intelligence to the Egyptians that Syria was going to be attacked by Israel. So Egyptians began mobilizing their troops. This led Israel to preemptively strike Egypt since it thought it was mobilizing its troops for an attack against Egypt. With that being said, the 1967 war takes place. The Arab armies are defeated. This also leads to the end of Pan-Arabism in the region due to the failure of the Arab states to be able to defeat this small country of Israel. And it also results in Israel occupying the territories of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as the Golan Heights. So you see this mass takeover and the occupation of Palestinians or Palestinian territory. UN Resolution 242 is also issued during this time. This calls for the military forces of Israel to withdraw from the borders of 1967 and to no longer occupy the Palestinian territory. However, with the win in 1967 by the Israelis, you also see this track to more revisionist policies. Israel really feels emboldened at this time. It just defeated, it's a small country, this very new country. It just defeated these strong Arab armies in the region. Many of them claim that it's, sort of this God-given right that they should be able to take over and occupy what is historically Judea and Samaria, or what is referred to as the West Bank today. So you start to see this really push towards this more revisionist, right-wing Israeli politics to further take over not only even the West Bank. Some are even calling for Israel to take over part of Transjordan, right, to expand its territorial bounds. So during this time, we also see a shift in Israeli politics. The Labour Party is very popular from 1968 till about 1977. They actually supported the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. In 1977, we see a change from the Labour Party to the Likud Party. Now, this really begins the shift to this more right-wing government in Israel. They support the settlement construction. They also put security and economic policy more at the forefront of their policy rather than achieving peace with the Palestinians or ending the conflict. Just for you guys to also have some background on some of the other major political parties in Israel, you have the Shah's Party and also the Jewish Home Party. Naftali Bennett is part of the Jewish Home Party. For those who follow these politics very closely, we almost saw a collapse of the Israeli government in the past week or two. Thankfully, because of the Jewish Home Party willing to stay in the coalition government, Netanyahu's government did not collapse. But if you guys have any questions on that, we can definitely talk about that during the Q&A. The first Intifada occurred in 1987. Essentially, this was a protest against the Israeli occupation. Again, the occupation had gone on for about 20 years by this point. Now, we also see the formation of a very important group that plays a large role in the politics of Israel-Palestine today. Hamas begins to form in about 1987. This is a reaction not only to the first Intifada, but also to the prolonged occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And originally, its charter did call for the destruction of Israel. And so, and they will also, they condoned the use of violence in their resistance measure. By 1991, we really start to see a push towards the peace process, right? So we have the Madrid Conference in 1991. This sets up the foundation for what would take place in 1993, known as the Oslo Accords. And essentially, the Oslo Accords is one of the most, it's a breakthrough at the time, right? You see, finally, for the first time ever, an agreement is made between the Israelis and Palestinians. This also establishes the Palestinian Authority. And it establishes 3 areas within the West Bank. Areas A, B, and C. Area A would be under official Palestinian Authority control. That constituted about 18%. Area B was both Palestinian and Israeli control, which was about 22%. And Area C was considered under Israeli control for security measures, and that constituted about 60% of the territory. This is an historic picture here of Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn at the time, shaking hands with President Bill Clinton. It's an iconic picture, so I just wanted to throw that on there for you guys to see that moment. However, the Oslo Accords never really become successful. Both parties do not fully fulfill the Oslo Accords. Area C was supposed to gradually come under Palestinian control within 18 months after the signing of the Oslo Accords, except for certain final status issues. East Jerusalem wasn't counted in Area C. However, we never see that after 18 months of the Oslo Accords. Tensions begin to heighten. We also see 9/11 happen, so this creates also some anti-Arab rhetoric here in the West. And then Ariel Sharon decides to visit the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that is sort of the boiling point for everyone in the region, and things start to become increasingly violent. We start to see suicide bombings in Tel Aviv carried out by some Palestinian factions. We also see a harsh response by the IDF, which results in a lot of Palestinian civilians also being killed, and so both sides are really at each other's throats at this point, going at it. By 2005, Mahmoud Abbas takes control as the president of the PLO, and then Palestinians start calling for national elections. Now, I want to talk about these elections very quickly because I think they're very important in terms of what's really taken place during this time and how that still impacts today. Yes? Well, the Temple Mount is really, it's a religious holy place, really to both, all three faiths actually. But it was sort of seen as a power play against the Palestinians. They shut down the Temple Mount to all Palestinians and exclusively only allowed Jews on that day to go. So, the Palestinians really just took that as an insult, and why was it the boiling point? I can't say that it was just that single factor, right? There was a lot of other things happening in the background during this time that all attributed. But I think that was just that one event that really pushed people over the top, because it really showed that Israel wasn't going to relinquish East Jerusalem. It really showed that Israel has the power over this, and we're going to use that power to really do what we want to do, especially so many years after the signing of the Oslo Accords and no really significant gains being made in the peace process at the time.
He also had to like 200 soldiers,
right? Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. They closed it, and it was a very big power play. It was a very big power play. I think he went on with also some settlers as well. But yeah, they were under the guise of the IDF with a large amount of Israeli soldiers. Okay, so the elections. So elections take place in 2006. These are actually internationally monitored by the United States and the international community. They are considered free and fair elections under the United Nations and the United States, so they all took part in this. And something happens. Hamas actually wins the elections. Originally, Hamas wasn't even going to take part in the elections. They decided to, and then they actually end up winning by a few parliamentary seats. This sends everybody into a rubble, right? The West, the United States, consider Hamas a terrorist organization. However, Fatah was really unable to make any significant gains in the peace process. Palestinians hadn't seen any change. So Hamas was seen as sort of their alternative. It's also important to note, Hamas a lot of the times is highlighted as a terrorist organization, but they also provide a lot of social services in the Palestinian territories. Schools, hospitals, childcare, teachers, nurses, things like this. So a lot of Palestinians sort of saw them as a hope, right? Fatah isn't doing anything for us. We gave them their chance. And you start to see this shift to this more towards Hamas. Now, obviously, Hamas is a more militant group. Fatah, by this point, had renounced the use of violence. Hamas had not. And this results, so Hamas winning the elections results in a civil war between the parties. The end result ends up Hamas taking over Gaza Strip and Fatah takes over the West Bank. Unfortunately, Hamas and Fatah today still have not been able to form a unitary government. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to the more current politics. But the reason I want to really focus on this section is because I want to talk about the inclusion moderation hypothesis. And I think the perfect example is if we look at Fatah and the PLO. Initially, they also used violence as a way of achieving their goals, right? They went from, using violence to now being the party that Israel deals with. As Fatah became more involved in the political process, they were forced to moderate. Now, I think during these elections, when Hamas won, the international community really had an opportunity to think carefully about how they were going to respond to this. They ostracized Hamas, they blacklisted them, they confined them to the Gaza Strip. They did not recognize that the Palestinians voted for Hamas. I mean, in a democracy, if people vote for these people as their leader, you have to respect that. Unfortunately, the international community did not. They blacklisted Hamas, they pushed them back. Now, obviously, I'm presenting a counterfactual here, but I think it was an important opportunity for the international community to engage Hamas rather than blacklist them. And the argument that I put forth is, if Hamas was engaged, how would this have changed the dynamic? Right? If Hamas was engaged and said, okay, look, Palestinians want you to represent them, you guys need to moderate your positions, you need to, renounce the use of violence, would Hamas move towards this? And I would argue, yes, that they would have, especially since even more recently we've seen Hamas moderate their position. They've actually called for the recognition of a Palestinian and an Israeli state on the 1967 borders, whereas before they used to call for the complete destruction of the state of Israel. So implicitly, they have recognized the state of Israel at this point, although officially they have not, but that's due more to internal social dynamics rather than foreign policy perspective. Yes, I.
So why do you think that we didn't engage Hamas? Do you think it was because of 9/11 and the rhetoric that they play with, or?
I think that's a good question. I don't work for Department of State. I wish I knew. Obviously, I think the elections sort of threw a curveball at the international community. I think they were so predetermined that Fatah would win these elections, and that it would show this shift towards democracy in the Middle East and especially the Palestinian territories. And when Hamas won, this terrorist organization wins, they were so surprised. I also think they couldn't work with Hamas because, again, under their definition as a terrorist organization, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? And again, in this pretext of 9/11 happening, they didn't really want to seem as giving in to Hamas demands or Palestinian demands, especially since we categorize them as a terrorist organization. Yes?
As you previously mentioned, that the international community's presumption that the new Fatah was going to win. Doesn't this also be a clear demonstration, especially in current days, that they don't play so much as a mediating role in today's peace process because they just demonstrate that they really do not care and have apathetic beliefs due to the predetermination notion that they already know that they have an idea of who's going to win without truly acknowledging what's going on?
Absolutely. I think the United States has a really good track record of this, right? We've done this in plenty of different states. Every state should be a democracy until they elect somebody that we don't like, and then it becomes a problem. So, yeah, absolutely. And, we'll talk about the U.S. playing its role as a mediator a little further along in my talk as well. So that's a great question. Yes?
I'm not sure exactly what year it was. I know, between the transition of, Yasser Arafat and Abbas, the West Bank did have to give up arms as part of, peace discussion. So I think that probably was the main reason why Hamas was able to win in the region of Gaza, because Palestinians necessarily didn't want to give up arms, and they saw it as, why should we give up our arms when they can protect theirs? And majority Palestinians now kind of regret having given up their arms, which is why Hamas was able to take such a lead within those elections.
Absolutely, right? So, by 1988, actually, the PLO had officially recognized the state of Israel based on the 67 borders. And that was, a precondition that would lead to Oslo in 1993. But by Oslo, yes, Fatah had renounced the use of violence. They wanted to use diplomacy. Initially Palestinians were excited about this, right? And that is why they were so willing to give up their arms, because they thought diplomacy would work, right? But a decade after diplomacy not having worked, Palestinians were hopeless, right? They didn't see any future. The international community wasn't doing anything to help their situation. The United Nations wasn't doing anything to help their situation. No one was sort of enforcing the agreements made under the Oslo Accords. And, for all those who study international relations or political science, everyone knows ultimately the use of force becomes the ultimate determinant of what's going to happen, right? So to ask of any state to give up their arms, I mean, really, this is it's a very serious negotiation, because once you give that, you're susceptible to the use of force by your neighbors. And ultimately, yes, when diplomacy fails, when sanction fails, when all other means fails, the use of force becomes the last, ingredient. Yes.
Not to continue on the slide, but what is your opinion on how crucial, particularly Israeli and Jewish interest groups in the United States, were in contributing to the international backlash from this election, even though, Hamas probably winning and continuing the democratization of Palestine might have been a greater stability force for the region as a whole? How do you feel that the interest groups in the United States influenced that action?
I mean, the interest groups in the United States have a lot of power. AIPAC is one of the largest lobbies. Two prominent IR theorists actually wrote about that. The Israel lobby with Mearsheimer and Walt. And it's not even just Jewish lobbies. There's also a lot of evangelical Christian lobbies that have a lot of impact in the politics of this region. So, I mean, yeah, it's big bucks. I mean, as far as the election, how those lobbies are concerned with this particular election, is your question?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the background on, what those lobbies did in the back dealings. However, I know that, Israel, again, Israel has a deal with Fatah, right? It does not have a deal with Hamas. So when Hamas, Fatah is still an institution, or could still be molded, right? It's an organization that can still be molded. But Hamas is not. So when Hamas won, Hamas essentially represents a group that Israel and the United States could not control. Whereas Fatah, on the other hand, was a group that it could. So I think, that also played a large dynamic into it. Yeah. All right. So we'll move on. Were there any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Why don't you talk about Israel willing to give up the West Bank in 2000 and 2008 and it being rejected by the Palestinian Authority or by the PLO?
Sure. So you're talking about Ehud Barak's deal?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So you know what? I'll actually just talk about that right now. So do you want to explain the deal?
From what I understand is Israel was willing to give up 97% of the West Bank with a road between Gaza and the West Bank connecting the two territories. To give Palestinians the right to self-determination in the region. And not only in 2000, that was the first time. In 2008, they offered 100% of the West Bank and Gaza with a road connecting the two after land swaps, because obviously, like you've said,
right,
the Jews were not necessarily willing to give up Jerusalem, but they were willing to do land swaps and give them the right to self-determination and to really build up
right, a
Palestinian country.
So those figures are inaccurate. Okay. Ehud Barak's deal. Now, keep in mind, the mandate, right? Israel took control of 78%, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip constitute 22%. So already, of this 100% of land, Palestinians on the 67 borders are left with 22%. Now, they've accepted that 22% as a future state, right? Now, of that 22%, many argue that Ehud Barak offered them 97%. 97% of the 22%. Okay? So they were already... Now, he was... And in reality, they didn't offer 97%. They actually offered closer to around 80% of the 22%. He wanted to keep 10% on the border with Jordan as a security zone, and he wanted to keep another 10% in East Jerusalem and for the settlements. Okay, so when a lot of people talk about that deal, he also rejected East Jerusalem as the capital for the Palestinians in that deal, and he also rejected the right of return for Palestinians in that deal. So, no Palestinian leader could really accept any deal, that, one, I don't think any Palestinian leader can accept a deal with no right of return. That would be political suicide.
When you say the right of return, do you mean going into mainland Israel, the
yes,
Palestinians going back into
yes, yes, all the Palestinians that were dispersed in 1948, those Palestinians being able to return to their land. Yeah. Okay. No problem. I'll skip over the Israeli-Gaza wars. Obviously, once Hamas wins, we see these three engagements in Gaza. If you guys want to talk more about this in the question section, we can. I just don't want to run out of time. But yeah, after Hamas takes control, Israel puts a full siege and blockade on the Gaza Strip. They control all the borders, aerial as well as ground, as well as the sea line. And so no Palestinians can go in or out of the Gaza Strip. You see these 3 wars that take place against Hamas. They largely result in a lot of civilians in Gaza being killed. And these 3 wars take place during this time. All right, I wanted to talk more about the current events now, right? So I think one of the things we need to mention is the separation wall or the security wall that Israel is currently building in the West Bank. This is really changing the reality of the ground. If you guys see here, and let's see if does the mouse show on here. So this red line actually represents the security barrier that's being built in the West Bank. 85% of the wall being built actually falls within the Palestinian territories in the West Bank. So if you see here, without borders being predetermined, without any deal being made, we already see Israel changing the facts on the ground and creating a different reality. A lot of that red line comes into here, so you see these large swaths of land being taken over, as well as into here, all throughout East Jerusalem. So again, 85% of this wall encompasses, is built on the West Bank. A lot of Palestinians see this as really Israel creating an artificial border without any predetermined peace deal already being made in the region. I also want to talk a little bit about Arabs in Israel. The Arab population, or Palestinian Arabs in the state of Israel, there's a lot of systematic discrimination that occurs with them. We actually had a visiting professor here. Her name was Dr. Alian. She was here visiting. She was actually an Israeli citizen, Palestinian Israeli citizen, and she taught at Hebrew University. And she would always talk to me about how she felt in being, a Palestinian citizen of Israel. A lot of the mistrust between the two different communities, and we see that. There's also a lot of systematic discrimination in terms of building permits being harder to obtain in Arab neighborhoods. You see funding differentials between the school systems. You also see a lot of weaker infrastructure that's built in some of the Arab neighborhoods or are underfunded in comparison to some of the Jewish neighborhoods. Also, Israel recently passed the nation-state law. This further marginalized the Arab population in Israel. Many saw this as sort of, the nation-state law, for those who don't know, essentially states that self-determination is the national right of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. So the Arabs, and it also downgraded the language of Arabic from an official language in Israel to a minority language in Israel. So many of the Arab populations in Israel saw this as a very discriminatory law against them, and made them feel more marginalized within their own state. Settlements. So settlements are another huge issue in Israel-Palestine, especially in the West Bank. The first settlers arrived in Hebron after the 1967 war. By about 1993, at the signing of Oslo, we see about 100,000 settlers in the West Bank. By 2016, we see this number increase to about 400,000 settlers, and approximately 132 settlements and more than 100 illegal outposts. Now, these settlements are considered illegal under international law, and these figures also exclude East Jerusalem. When including East Jerusalem, there's about another 200,000 Israelis who live in East Jerusalem, and as I mentioned, they're illegal under international law and by the United Nations. So to just give you guys a little view of what the settlements look like, all of these red dots are Israeli settlements that are built in the West Bank, and then the gold triangles are actually the outposts that are built in the West Bank. So you can kind of see, how many are being built in the West Bank and the sort of areas that they're being built in. Also, a lot of these settlements are connected by Jewish-only roads that Palestinians cannot use. This causes a lot of headache when it really restricts the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank as well. All right, so what about a future state of Palestine? So this map is actually from a U.S. Department of State report. The green area is Israeli-controlled area. The white area is Palestinian Authority-controlled area. Now, the running joke is, where would a Palestinian state be created if we wanted to create one today? Well, the Palestinian state would look like Swiss cheese, right? There's no contiguity between any of the territory. And you can see it's very systematic in the way that Israel has really separated the population centers within the West Bank. All right. the Great March of Return that's currently taking place in Gaza. These started back in March. It really accumulated to the most violent situation that we saw in May as the U.S. Embassy began to open as the U.S. opened its embassy in Israel, in Jerusalem. These protesters have been going weekly. They have mostly been nonviolent demonstrations. However, they have been met with live ammunition from IDF forces. Many of them have died, including not only protesters, unarmed protesters and civilians, but also paramedics have been targeted. Journalists have also been targeted. And many of these paramedics and journalists are out there in attire that clearly demarcates that they are press. So, again, it's this sort of unequal use, unbalanced use of force that we're seeing in response to really quell this Great March of Return that's taken place in Gaza. Now, many of these Gazans that are protesting are really calling for the right to be able to return back to their home, that right of return from 1948. And, they've been living under a siege of 10 years. Gaza also has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. It's nearly 50% unemployment rate. It is also about the smallest territory and has the highest population per square foot in the territory. There's about 2 million Gazans that live in there. And it's really rather remarkable that they've been able to survive, even after 10 years of siege. And actually, the United Nations has released a report that by 2020, Gaza would be uninhabitable. Okay? And that's not too far away. The U.S. as a mediator. So under Trump, we've seen a lot of changes happening as far as the U.S. position towards the Palestinians. First and foremost, we see a lot of sort of one-sided pressure. We have the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem, right? So that essentially takes Jerusalem off the table for all negotiations. The next thing we see is cuts to UNRWA. A lot of these are, UNRWA uses a lot of its funding for schools, health facilities, women's centers and programs. All of the cuts to UNRWA are also being, now UNRWA is completely defunded by the United States, actually. We see funding cuts to the Palestinian Authority, USAID, as well as East Jerusalem hospitals. The closing of the PLO office in Washington, D.C. that just happened a few months ago. And then we also see the Trump administration currently working on creating a new definition of Palestinian refugee, which can completely change the dynamic of, the 194 resolution of Palestinian refugees being able to return to their homelands. We also see the nomination of David Freeman as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. David Freeman actually has a long track record of being sort of anti-Palestinian. He's personally funded West Bank settlement projects, and he's publicly rejected Palestinian statehood. The reason this is dangerous is because the U.S. had an opportunity to perhaps put an ambassador in that may have been more middle ground. Unfortunately, I don't foresee this ambassador really being a fair mediator between the sides. But we'll see what happens. Now, one of my largest arguments is, for all the defunding that I have seen the Israeli government do to the Palestinians, obviously I would argue that I think the Trump administration is making a huge strategic mistake. However, in the context of things, we have not seen any pressure exerted by the United States on Israel. All of the pressure has been one-sided to really push the Palestinians to come to the negotiating table. Now I'm all for the U.S. cutting all of its funding to the Palestinian Authority if it wants to. However, if we're going to do that, the United States should really try to play a more even hand and also put pressure on the Israeli government side as well. We offer $3.8 billion per year to the Israeli government. That actually increased under the Obama administration. And after 50 years of West Bank occupation, we see a lot of unlawful killings. IDF soldiers have been caught on tape with extrajudicial killings of Palestinian citizens. Some even that have been arrested. A lot of unethical practices in terms of administrative detention, the arresting of minors in the West Bank. Yet no funding cuts, no pressure whatsoever from the U.S. side or from U.S. Congress. However, there is a silver lining. U.S. Rep. Betty McCollum actually just put forward a House resolution to condemn the Israeli policy of child detention. So I guess that's a silver lining in the mix of things. All right, so what stands for a future peace deal? Perfect. Hamas and Fatah. I would argue that the Palestinians need to get it together in terms of their leadership. There's a huge gap in Palestinian leadership currently. Hamas and Fatah have actually more recently, I can't speak to the facts right now because it's still in the preliminary stages, but actually Hamas and Fatah have been working on a unitary reconciliatory government currently. I even read some reports that said elections could be held within the next year or two in Palestine. So I'm very hopeful that Hamas and Fatah will be able to unite. I'm also hopeful that Hamas will sort of begin to moderate, which we've already seen it moving into that direction. But I'm also hopeful that the international community will really begin to take the Palestinian leadership seriously and engage Hamas rather than blacklist them. And I think that'll also help with the renunciation of violence on Hamas's part. The siege on Gaza has gone on way too long. Again, as I mentioned, the high unemployment rates, these citizens really just being suffocated, unable to live proper lives with dignity and respect. So I think we really need to look at putting pressure on Israel to end its siege on Gaza and really begin to engage Gaza. The status of Jerusalem, yes?
In terms of the siege, it's not just Israel that has a siege on Gaza, it's also Egypt. And not only that, but you also have the PLO in the West Bank, which is paying for the utilities of Gaza.
Right.
So
right.
I mean, it's not just, I guess, an Israeli problem. It also has to be sort of a decision that's made by the international community, because you have to get the PLO, Israel, and Egypt on the same mindset.
Absolutely. So a lot of the pressure from the Egyptian side of them closing the border has come from their deals with Israel. But you're absolutely right. The Egyptians have also closed their side of the border to the Palestinians. So a lot of Palestinians have resented this. And again, going back to the Hamas-Fatah point, you're absolutely right. Actually, Mahmoud Abbas has cut funding off to a lot of civil employees that still work for Fatah in the Gaza Strip. So again, that seeing that internal dispute, that also needs to be remedied. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The status of Jerusalem, which, as far as the Trump administration, I don't know what we're going to see happen in Jerusalem. I will say this, Palestinian residents of Jerusalem are not afforded the same rights as Jewish residents of Jerusalem. Jewish residents of Jerusalem are given citizenship within Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Palestinian residents within Jerusalem are only given residency, so they're not allowed to vote in elections. They also are really infringed in terms of trying to get building permits and things like that to renew or renovate their homes. Also, additionally, if a Jew in Jerusalem marries a Jew that perhaps lives in a settlement in the West Bank, they are allowed to move into Jerusalem with their new spouse. Unfortunately, Palestinians in Jerusalem that marry a Palestinian that does not live in Jerusalem actually has to move out of Jerusalem. They're not allowed to bring their new spouse to the city. The right of return. I think life under occupation for Palestinians. Guys, if we look throughout history, I think one of the major impacts of why Israel has not been able to maintain or achieve any sort of security or peace with the Palestinians is its continued occupation of the West Bank. If we look throughout history, occupations have always resulted in an unending cycle of violence. And as long as Israel continues to occupy the West Bank, I don't foresee any security in the future of Israel. Yes?
Can you talk about Israeli Zionism, not just in Palestine, but in neighboring Arab nations, especially Lebanon or Jordan or Egypt in the 70s and 80s?
Could I talk about Israeli Zionism?
Yeah.
In Lebanon?
Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, yeah.
There really isn't, there's really just one Zionist movement. After the creation of Israel in 1948, many Jews were expelled from the Arab lands, and many of them migrated to Israel. But there really wasn't any major Zionist movements that were happening in Lebanon or Arab countries surrounding. No. Yeah, remember, Zionism, its principle is to create a Jewish state and what was considered the Mandate of Palestine. Right. And we spoke about the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That really brings me to my final slide, which is a one state or two. Now, historically, the international consensus has always been a two-state solution. However, we're really seeing the facts and the reality on the ground change. And as I showed in my previous slide with the image of the West Bank and those Dunhams, I don't know where a Palestinian state would be created or how it would be created. I think the only viable option that the international community really needs to start moving towards is going to have to be a one-state solution. It really makes the most sense. And that one-state solution, it would be equal rights for everybody. However, this creates an impediment as far as the Israelis because there's a lot more Palestinians than there are Israelis. This would change the demographics, and innately Israel would lose its Jewish identity as a Jewish state. However, I think Israel can still remain a Jewish state metaphorically. I don't think literally it can remain a Jewish state. And the reason I say this is because in order to be a Jewish state and be a democracy, they're really two contradictory things. To have a demographic majority, this requires legislation that has to be passed, really policies of ethnic cleansing, or policies that limit the minority groups in that territory. So I think Israel is really at a pivotal fork in the road where it really needs to make a decision on what sort of state it wants to be. If it really truly wants to pursue a democracy, it needs to be equal rights for all, and I think move towards a one state. However, if it does not do that and it wants to maintain this Jewish majority in the state, I think it's further going to push Israel towards an apartheid-like state with segregation between the Arab and Jewish populations. So the one state ultimately resolves many final status issues, and again, the issues of Jerusalem. I mean, that one state solution would solve the issue of the settlements, would solve the issue of the right of return. Let the settlements in the West Bank stay. Let the Palestinians in the West Bank return to their homes if they wish prior to 1948. I've even had ideas of a federation, some sort of two-state single federation system where Palestinians and Israelis could have autonomy over their own respected areas, but still fall under one state with equal rights, as well as open freedom of movement between both sides as well. Because really both territories, all sides are really so economically intertwined that I don't think they'll be able to separate without having some sort of agreement with open borders and freedom of transportation. I think I saw the question here.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
Ladies first.
So one of the many glaring issues, particularly with Israeli foreign policy and shifting away from the one or two-state debate, is their blatant discriminatory refugee policy that they have been passing within the past couple of years. Now, although we can come to a consensus that the United States will probably never openly condemn Israel just because of the Foreign Relations Act, do you feel that with the discriminatory refugee policies that they are really passing that are in direct violation of international law, there will be any or at all backlash from the international community in terms of the big important actors if the U.S. does not make any condemnation?
Well, the U.S. has really protected Israel in the United Nations. Most resolutions that condemn either the refugee policy or the settlement policies are usually vetoed and protected. Is it time?
I have to go to a department meeting.
Okay.
So, all right, so I will see you guys all at the mosque tomorrow. This will be my class. And great job, Mohamed.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and finish up here.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
The class is until 3:15, right? All right, great. Cool. So we can continue. I think, again, the U.S. has really protected Israel in the international arena. Barack Obama, one of his last parting gifts before he went out, he abstained from a UN condemnation vote that passed. He abstained in that vote. But again, I think this is where the question of BDS really comes into play, right? Diplomacy has failed, right? Negotiations have failed. So what's the next step? There has to be some sort of pressure that's put on Israel, right? And I think that's what the BDS movement is really trying to further out, right? A grassroots movement rather than a movement that is left up to states and the international community. It's really a way for grassroots movements now and grassroots people to say, okay, look, what are we going to do to put pressure on the Israeli government in order to make them shift their policies? Yes.
So it's always continued that the solution to this did right there resolves many of the statuses. and it's obvious this has to be done through a secular version rather than. And I believe, would it be considered? I don't think it will be possible within this current generation's leadership, because with leaders such as Ismail Haniyeh in Hamas, because they're still consistent with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the inability of President Abbas in his current situation in Fatah, and the current fundamentalist nationalist right-wing cabinet that makes up for Netanyahu's administration. Would you think it plausible to be done in the next generation or the next leadership if elections should be held?
I really hope so. I really hope I get to see it in my lifetime, actually. I'm really praying. But I think a lot of stuff needs to be done, right? I think we need to, I think the problem with both sides is you really see there's no middle ground, right? No one's willing to really reach out on the middle ground. I mean, for instance, the Netanyahu government is increasingly right-wing. I mean, Netanyahu, part of his platform as he was running for re-election a few years ago, he said a Palestinian state would not be created under my tenure, my rule. So I don't think that opens up the door for any prospects to see during the time of Netanyahu, right? As far as Ismail Haniyeh or Khalid Meshal, I mean, these leaders of Hamas, again, Israel is an occupying power. Even under international law, and occupied people have the right to use violence as a tool of resistance when they're under occupation. To blame, one thing people want to look at violence, right? They look at just like the root cause of violence. They don't look at the root cause of the violence, right? They look at violence as just an action that took place. Let's question the legitimacy of this action. However, we're not looking at the social and political context under which this violence is taking place, right? BDS doesn't exist without the current Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, right? Hamas actually doesn't exist without the current policies in the First Intifada and its current policies towards the Palestinians. So a lot of these are reactionary to the political context, right? We have to look at, again, violence doesn't just occur out of nowhere, guys. There's a context to violence, right? Violence occurs within a context. So then rather at looking at the actions themselves, we really need to look at the context under which these are taking place and how do we fix that root problem. Yes? I'll come to you next. Yes, Yulana. I'll come to you next.
So, Mohamed, I wanted to ask a little bit about the research you've done, because I know you talked about, conducting research on Palestinian diaspora and their activism in the diaspora, correct?
Yes.
So with the recent election, us Palestinians were celebrating the election of Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian American. And there was an incident that took place where she had received a significant, well, not significant, I guess it was around $2,000 to $3,000 from J Street. So I wanted to add, and this was a huge issue for a lot of the BDS supporters who believed in the right of return, and that they could not cooperate with organizations like J Street and Jewish Voices for Peace, who are actually very active and influential, organizations against the occupation. But they could not come to terms with this because of the idea of the right of return.
Right.
So I wanted to ask, what has your experience been with while you were interviewing any Palestinian activists in the U.S. or in Europe, and what their opinion was with respect to the J Street issue in Rashida?
So I haven't interviewed anyone specifically regarding that specific issue, but I will say this. I personally like J Street as well as Jewish Voices for Peace. Like I said, I think these are good, moderate Jewish groups to work with, and we have to engage these Jewish groups, right? No matter what side of the line you're on, I always think cross-cultural engagement or cross-engagement is always a positive thing. As far as the right of return, I think it's sometimes blown up the amount of refugees that would return. For instance, right? I'm a Palestinian. My family is we come from a Palestinian. We're Palestinian refugees. My family came here in '67. I don't think I'm going to return to go live there. I have a life here, and I also think many Palestinians that have left or many Palestinians that are in the diaspora may not return. However, I think they should have the right to return. They should be able to make that choice, right? As far as Rashida Tlaib, with Ilhan Omar elected, Rashida Tlaib elected, we're starting to see some more progressive Democrats that are starting to have more of a vocal voice, sort of this anti-Israel, not really anti-Israel, but I want to say that are being critical of Israel, right? I mean, we've seen our U.S. Congress go without being even any ounce of criticism towards Israel. Or if you're critical of Israel, you're called anti-Semitic, right? You get labeled that brand. But I also think Rashida Tlaib and like Ilhan Omar, they need to tread lightly. We can't put the responsibility on them to be the vocal Palestinian voices in our government right now. They have other issues that they need to focus on. We also want to keep them in our Congress, right? So if they're too vocal too quickly, they might not get elected and re-elected in future years, right? So I don't think we can put the brunt of the burden on them to really advocate, but I absolutely think it's a good start for them to really start having this critical voice and making this part of the mainstream. Look, being critical of Israel is not anti-Semitic, okay? We can't make being critical of a nation state taboo either. Being critical of any nation state is a rightful right of any democracy, right? What happened in Pittsburgh was anti-Semitism. Criticizing Israel for its policy towards the Palestinians is not anti-Semitism. As soon as Israel changes that policy, then you see that criticism go away, right? So, I think there's a fundamental difference. And, especially here in U.S. society, we're really seeing that correlation between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. And I think that's very dangerous. I think it's a very dangerous development. I'm going to go with him, and then we'll go.
In terms of like what you were saying about the BDS movement, wouldn't you also sort of agree with the fact that the BDS movement would be harmful more so for Palestinians, as Palestinians who work in areas in Israel such as the Barkan Industrial Zone,
right.
The area around the Dead Sea, they make 4 times more than Palestinians who work in just the West Bank. And with unemployment being so high in areas such as the Gaza Strip and also the West Bank, taking those opportunities, taking those jobs away from them with companies such as SodaStream and other large international corporations, that would hurt the Palestinian people more so than the Israeli who is working in technology and stuff like that.
Right.
So if you're boycotting these products that are coming out of Israel, you're going to have to hurt the Palestinians as well. And also, isn't it a bit, I guess you can say, unrealistic to say you could boycott all Israeli products, all Israeli inventions? Because,
right.
I mean, things like the internet, Google, all the cell phones,
Waze.
a bunch of different things came
right.
from
Everyone likes Waze.
Israeli inventors.
So again, as far as BDS, I think there's a fine line between engagement and boycott. For instance, Airbnb's recent decision to unlist homes and settlements. I think that's a good decision, and I'll tell you why, right? Others may not agree with me in this room, but the reason being is that is profiting off of the dispossession of Palestinian land, okay? It also only unlists its properties in the settlements, not in Israel proper, right? However, in the reverse of that, we had the recent student, and her name slips my mind. Lana, can you help me? The one that was held in the airport? What was her name? Yes. I can't. Her name. Yeah, her name slips my mind. She was from Florida. She was accused of taking part in BDS, and yet she was going to study at an Israeli university. Yeah. In my opinion, I think that's good engagement, right? I support Palestinians going, and I think Palestinians should be allowed to go and study amongst, within these universities. But in fact, actually, by Israel not letting her in, they were effectively allowing her to boycott the university, right, themselves. So I thought that was a little bit of ironic. But, jokes aside, right, I think that's positive engagement, and I think we need more of that. I'd love to see Israeli students go and study in Palestinian universities. I'd love to see Palestinians go and study in Israeli universities. And the same thing, people from here in the States to go and study. So that, I'm all for that positive engagement. But like I said, the Airbnb decision, profiting off of that. Many of these Palestinians that work for these companies in the West Bank, there was a poll conducted actually that asked those Palestinians, would they rather work for these Israeli companies? And actually almost 85% of them responded saying that they would, yes, while they're happy with those jobs, they'd much rather work for Palestinian-owned companies rather than Israeli-owned companies. Because there needs to be that
You also have to remember there's an economic side this. I lived in the Palestinian territories, and let me give you a simple example. Sour cream. Have you been to the Mallam? They're very well known for their sour cream.
I did not know that.
So you go to, so you go to the supermarket, Israelis and Palestinians eat the sour cream with bread as if it's like a dip.
Yeah.
You go to a supermarket, what's the sour cream that's sold out always? The first sour cream. And there's a Palestinian brand as well, the Israeli one. Chips. Palestinians will buy the Israeli chips because they think it tastes better than the Palestinian chips. So what's happening on an economic scale is that Palestinians are rejecting their own products and purchasing the products of what is their occupier. So you do make a good argument, but you have to remember, politics aside, on an economic scale, for Palestine to ever be an independent state with a viable economy, it actually needs to support its own products. So my issues with BDS actually aren't the products, it's maybe boycotting of academia and these channels where we could actually engage, but when it comes to products, you want a disposition, Palestinian population to actually use its own products as opposed to Israeli products.
No, of course. Yeah, you want to promote economic growth within the region.
Absolutely.
And I'm not too sure, but I think that the Barkan zone within it's in Israel. I think that they also split profits between certain groups, maybe the PLO.
I mean, probably. I've never heard that, but probably.
Right. I mean, Lana's an economist by training, so I know she may know more about that than I do. But yeah, I mean, as she mentioned, the academic side is one thing, but yeah, there is an economic component to all of this, right? And if you look at any state development projects or at least state formation, states need to be able to economically provide for themselves, right? So we have to have socioeconomic development. We have to have socioeconomic development in the West Bank and in Gaza, or else you're going to have this, you're going to have this high unemployment rate, mostly young kids, and that's actually a recipe for disaster for the state of Israel. Yeah. Right? And it also opens up, it opens up opportunities for more violent radical groups also to get recruits, right? I mean, that same sort of literature surrounds gang violence. Right, that feeling of, okay, I have nothing else to do, I'm going to go join a gang, right? So the same thing for this Palestinian case. Without socioeconomic development and a way for them to thrive economically on their own, you're going to see a lot of them turn to violence. Yeah. Yes, Donna. Oh, I got a lot over here. Okay, we'll come to this side next. All right.
So that's a huge issue again with us needing to kind of support our own economy. And then in terms of the Hamas and Fatah elections, I do hope that it does happen. There is a huge disapproval rating for Abbas. The only issue is it's like a conspiracy candidate of Dahlan returning to the region, which the Gaza Strip strongly distastes because of his terrorism, or I guess his violence against Hamas leaders. And then in terms of the Palestinian diaspora, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, where we want to support our Palestinians abroad within Palestine and the refugees in Lebanon that aren't protected by the UN and so forth, because Lebanon has adopted a charter. But then, there's people that are being listed on Canary Mission for supporting BDS or for calling out Israel and condemning them, and that kind of puts us Palestinians in harm, where I've seen Palestinian students who are in their residencies and going to grad school being kicked out of their programs because Canary Mission has kind of stopped them from continuing on. And even with, I think in Michigan, there was a professor who wouldn't sign off on the student's trip.
Yeah, he wouldn't write the letter of recommendation. Yeah.
So it's, sorry,
No, absolutely. I mean, like I said, the criticism of Israel, I mean, you're continually becoming targeted if you criticize Israel. And I think, that's a dangerous development. One, it's dangerous for any democracy. Two, I think, is, for those who support Israel, I think that's also a dangerous development. The reason being, if you don't criticize your state, how can it get better, right? So, I think for those who love Israel also and want to see Israel succeed as, a prosperous state, I think they need to know that, hey, I can criticize my own government and not have to fear. I mean, look at the recent holding of Peter Breitbart. He's a progressive American Jew. He loves Israel. But he also recognizes what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. He's taken part of a few protests, and he was recently held. So, where does that line get drawn? I mean, if an American Jewish journalist is held by Israeli forces, I mean, imagine how the everyday Palestinian, the layman Palestinian is treated, So yeah, again, I think that's, an important and development. And then, as far as the economics, again, I mean, you have to have economic development in order to have a prosperous state, or else you're going to have these high unemployment rates. And a lot of those that are unemployed, so just to mention, actually, the Palestinian territories have one of the highest education rates. 98% literacy rates, also highest education rates among women. So they're a very highly educated population. And when you have a highly educated population with no jobs and no way to support their families, it's a recipe for disaster. Yes, who's first? We'll go with you.
Thank you. So I have a kind of a two-part question, a little bit domestic and then foreign policy. So you were talking about the Arab population in Israel, how they feel like second-class citizens. They obviously have a socioeconomic disadvantage. And in the politics of, you obviously have the Likud party, which is conservative. So what political representation do they look towards to? And as far as the foreign policy, we were talking about the U.S. being one-sided towards Palestine and Israel. So what allies does Palestine have, and what role do they play in the international arena?
Great question. So as far as the Arab citizens, I mean, there are Arab parties in the Knesset. They're a minority. And in fact, actually, no Arab party has ever been part of the coalition government in Israel in its history. But, I mean, there are Arab parties there. So a lot of the Arabs will vote for those Arab parties. But again, they're a minority. They don't have much influence in the actual politics and how things are run. But they do exist. As far as the international community, I mean, I think Europe is sort of on the leading edge of this. There's actually recent legislation that's going through Ireland currently to ban Israeli settlement products. Just settlement products. It wouldn't ban products from Israel proper, but it would ban Israeli settlement products. So you're seeing a lot of European countries sort of kind of move in that direction, more progressive European countries. There's also states like, for instance, China and Russia. They don't recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. It's mostly European and the United States that do. Actually, and Russia has engaged Hamas previously in recent politics. It has not. But when Hamas was first elected, it did try to engage. So again, you see, and actually, in fact, the Palestinian state has much recognition throughout the entire world. I want to say somewhere around like 180 states have, maybe less. I don't know the exact figures.
More than two-thirds.
Yeah, more than two-thirds have definitely recognized the state of Palestine. And if you look at a world map of the states that haven't recognized Palestine, it's Australia, European states, and the United States. Yeah. Yes.
So I also want to ask you a question about the region as a whole. So Israel has courted a stronger relationship, for instance, with Egypt and the Palestinians. Like I come from a Sunni Muslim family that traces heritage to the Middle East too. And so we no longer really talk about Israel and Palestine anymore because we don't like Iran so much now, So the question I have for you is, in the context of like the global Middle Eastern power struggle between like Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran loves to be an apologist for Palestine now and loves to talk about those issues. So does even Bashar al-Assad. But you hear like Saudi Arabia and its allies obviously not really being so vocal about that. How does that affect their foreign policy? And do people in the Middle East does their sympathy for like Saudi Arabia versus Iran change depending on who talks about Palestine the most?
Well, so yeah, Iran has absolutely been a champion for Palestinians. Saudi Arabia has as well, but not recently. In fact, you're actually starting to see a warming of relations between Netanyahu and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. You're seeing relations normalize and sort of warm between Saudi Arabia, Egypt, under Sisi and Netanyahu. And yeah, I mean, Iran is further being isolated. You're also seeing a huge anti-Iran rhetoric, especially here in the United States, right? Even amongst the Israelis themselves. Netanyahu, when he gave his last UN speech, he didn't mention a single thing about the peace process amongst the Palestinians. Almost the majority of his speech was about the threat of Iran. As far as the Arab world, there's huge support amongst the Arab world in regards to the Palestinians and the struggle. That's even within countries, whereas the leadership may not reflect that. So the average, everyday citizen of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, huge majority of Jordanians are actually, Palestinian, that population. But yeah, a lot of the populations within those states all support the Palestinian struggle, even though their leadership may not reflect that. But again, you have to look at those leaders playing into the context of the politics and their strategic aims in the region. What's more important, their goals or trying to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Yeah.
And on the slide you championed for that one-state solution with the two federalized areas. But you said the key point would be right of return, making sure that Palestinians who are expelled would be able to come back. How would you deal with Israeli-occupied areas that the Palestinians once occupied? Would it be the Israelis being expelled from their current homes in order to make room for the new Palestinians coming back in?
That's an interesting question. I haven't, I'm not a policymaker. Thankfully, I can leave that to the diplomats, the politicians, right? But yeah, I mean, again, it's an idea that I put out there. That's a really great question. I mean, there's a lot of intricacies, I think, that would need to be worked out formally. But I mean, I don't really have an answer for it. But good question. Yes.
So, all the policies that you've explained to us earlier, they kind of remind me of the Nuremberg laws in Germany during the 1930s. And I'm just wondering, how can people that were subjugated under these laws, these discriminatory laws, then implement the same kind of laws without, how do they excuse that sort of action without actually kind of recognizing what they're doing? And how can the U.S., who preaches equality among people, all people, how can they support these actions without actually doing anything about it?
All right. So I'll start with this. I think it's rather ironic, actually, during the British Mandate period, that the UK and US actually supported the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement called for an ethno-religious creation of a state based on ethno-religious backgrounds, and both of these were countries that prided themselves on creating states for equality of all citizens, right, regardless of religion or ethnicity. So I think that's one ironic point. Now the second thing is, I've heard people that compare this to, these sort of Nuremberg laws, or sort of the implementation of, these laws, and now, right, the argument is the Jews are doing the same thing to another people that was done to them previously and historically. But I think that also is what fears, into the Israeli, that's one of the fears of the Israeli psyche. Right, that they don't want to return to this, so it justifies by any means the use of making sure that they create and have their own safe state. However, I think within the Israeli psyche, there's this factor where I don't think Israelis legitimately, and I actually believe this, I don't think Israelis realize how powerful they are. Right, because of their long history of being subjugated to persecution, right? And again, we can't deny this history. This absolutely happened. The policies and what was carried out, the things that the Jews were subjected to throughout history, is absolutely unfortunate, and despicable, right? But again, how to change that? So I think, again, how is the Jewish state going to be remembered? I think that's a question that Israelis are going to have to grapple with. If you read into Jewish theology, right, and their sort of religious beliefs, I mean, Judaism has so many ties to talks about liberation, freedom, right? That's like almost built into the religion. So then to deny the Palestinians of that and to be the cause of that, I think that's a direct contradiction to it being a Jewish state within itself. But yeah, previous crimes being, implemented on them, should that be a justification for what Israel's currently doing? It shouldn't be. But is it something that we could try to understand and reason with? I think we could. Yes. Or actually, Usman, he had his hand up first. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for speaking to all of us today.
Oh, thank you for coming.
My question is understandably somewhat controversial, but I'm going to ask it.
Sorry, bring on the controversy.
It's okay. It's okay. And I will ask this as respectfully as possible. Regarding what you said earlier about one state versus two states, personally, I'll just let you know I support a two-state solution. With all its, even though it seems virtually impossible right now, but I still believe in it. If what you say works, if the one-state solution would be, let's say, implemented someday, what would happen? What would you realistically foresee happening to the Jews in a future Palestine? And I guess the epitome of my question is, why don't Jews deserve a state of their own?
Right.
That is my question. I recognize the right of the Palestinians to have their own state. As a Jew, I fully support it. However, I think it's also unfair to deprive us of a state. So that's just, so.
All right.
Like,
so I'll say this. I can't contradict Jews wanting to have their own state, because then that would make me a hypocrite, right? I say it up here and I argue for Palestinians, for them to have a right to their own state, and then to say that Israelis shouldn't have a right to their own state. But I think we have to look at what type of state. Okay, and I think this is where the importance, creating, again, you said you were going to say this as respectfully as possible, so I'm going to say this as respectfully as possible. I think the notion of any ethno-religious state is complete baloney. I think if the United States was to come out and say, you know what, we're going to remain a white majority state, that's going to cause policy, that's going to enforce, that will enforce the creation of policies to make sure whites stay the majority, right? And for any state, right? So whether it's a Muslim state saying we want to be only a Muslim state, or, the idea of a nation state that surrounds a religion or an ethnicity, I think is a bad idea. And the reason I mean that is the modern nation state is supposed to create it to provide security for all of its citizens, regardless of religion. We live in a globalized world. We live in a world nowadays where, there's not a single ethnic makeup or religious makeup in any one territory. We have all intermingled, cross-cultural, multicultural, right? So for any state to say, you know what, we're going to become a state only for this people, I think is a rather dangerous idea. Do Jews deserve a safe place to have and a home to call their own? Yes, absolutely. I would argue and I would support that position, right? But should that state also mean equal rights for all of its inhabitants? Yes, absolutely. I would argue for that position. So I think, Israel, again, the Palestinian National Movement called for a secular democratic state, one person, one vote. There were Jews, Arab Jews, living in Palestine before the European Jews started migrating there, before the idea of Zionism. Those Arab Jews, they were meshed with the society. Actually, my grandfather in the 1930s had a tailor shop. His partner was a Jew, in Ramallah. So they worked together, they lived together. Even if you go back and look at the history of Muslim-Jewish relations, Jews fared better under Arab lands and Arab rulers than they did under any Christian rulers. They were being persecuted in Europe, they were being killed in Europe, and Jews were living peacefully in southern Spain, they were living peacefully in Morocco and Egypt, Maimonides, Averroes. You had all these great Jewish scholars and people of the past, and they were all part of great, Muslim empires, right? So, I think that relationship there really in 1948, that changed with the creation of Israel. People always talk about, Arabs and Jews hate each other. But the Arabs expelled, again, what is the political context in which this is occurring in? This occurred in the creation of the State of Israel. If the State of Israel was never created, there's Yemeni Jews, there are Iraqi Jews, there are Syrian Jews. There was a lot of Jews, Iranian Jews, believe it or not, right? We all know there's actually Iranian Jews. So all of them were integrated into all of these societies, and they lived, as normal people, as normal citizens. Yes, historically we could talk about the dhimmi status and all that sort of stuff, but that was sort of the delineation between Muslim subjects and non-Muslim subjects, right? And I could talk more about that if anyone wants to know more about that in the Q&A, but I don't want to divert here. But I think Jews would live peacefully amongst Arabs, and you know what? As a matter of fact, You know, the only people I've ever met that love hummus, falafel, and tabbouleh as much as I do are Israeli Jews. All right? I promise you. So I think, you know, many of them, you know, we're more alike than we are different. You know, and me and you, we know each other. We have a good relationship with each other. You know, I'd love to get Arabs and Israelis in that part of the world thinking along those same lines. Yeah. I don't know if we have to end. Can we keep going? I don't know. Okay. Sure. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yep.
I have a cultural question since I'm an anthropology major. How do you feel as an Arab man and since the diaspora of Palestine and other Arab states and how they've migrated to places like Europe and the United States, and how do you see that there's a change in the mainstream culture being affected by your cultures? Do you see that it's meshing? Because you know how they have this whole concept of the United States as a melting pot, all the cultures make up the initial identity of it. But I see it. I don't know if I'm the only one who sees it because I care to see it. But do you see that it's changing the United States as a whole?
Absolutely. You know, I think there's.
How do you feel about that?
You know, there's a lot of more interracial marriages happening. There's a lot of more, you know, people that are, you know, different, marrying people of different backgrounds and faiths. You know, like I said, there's a lot more cross-cultural interaction going on, and you know, we live in a completely different time. I mean, modes of transportation in the last 100 years have changed completely than they have in any other point in human history. You know, it used to take 3 months to get from here to Europe. Now we can be there in a few hours on an airplane. You know, so you're seeing a lot more cross-cultural exchange. And, you know, one of the biggest arguments, you know, to take it back to Israel and Palestine, you know, one of the biggest arguments people always say is, oh, well, you know, they'll never get along. You know, the original sin has been committed already. That hatred is just going to exist forever. I completely disagree. You know, and the first argument I would make towards that is we dropped a bomb on Japan. Right. We dropped a nuclear weapon, you know, an atomic bomb on Japan. And now we're one of their closest allies. So through generations, I definitely think, you know, there can be a warming and that cross-cultural change. And we're already seeing Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, you know, connect, marry. There's actually NGO programs that their entire mission is to create that sort of exchange between Israelis and Palestinians, whether it's through soccer matches, academic institutions, conferences, things like that. Their sole purpose is to create that exchange amongst Palestinians and Israelis as well. So, you know, I think unless this sort of path is reversed quickly, will it take some time for people to forget? Will it take some time for those two societies to mesh together? I think it will. But we have to start at some point, right? Because if not, what's the alternative? And the alternative is what scares me. You know? Yes?
Just to add on to what she said, I did have the opportunity to meet some Israelis abroad in Turkey this year. A lot of them were Arab Jews originally, like their great-grandparents or grandparents, so they're second, first-generation Israelis. And one, like, we have like a great friendship now. She actually created with some of her friends, I want to say like a safe haven for LGBT Israelis and Palestinians living within the region. And they've been able to learn the languages. She's learned Arabic from her grandparents and so forth. So I definitely think that there has been some cross-cultural exchange.
Absolutely. Usman, can I use you as an example?
Sure.
Can you tell them your background? If I don't put you on the spot.
Okay.
Usman has actually a very interesting background. Let them know.
My father is Sunni Muslim from Lebanon, from Tripoli actually, and my mother is Cuban Jewish. I have both Jewish, Israeli, and Lebanese Cuban family members, and I really grew up speaking, you know, Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, you know, like. It's something.
So he's my evidence. Here's my evidence of my argument.
It's possible, guys. It doesn't look like it, but.
No, it is, and I think it's gonna happen with people like us. You know, people like us in this room who can sit down. I mean, you know, I'm actually very happy this went as well as it did. You know, because. Again, having this intellectual discourse, having this intellectual exchange of ideas, right? We've had multiple ideas presented here. We talked about a lot of controversial topics, some of which I didn't think we were going to talk about. But I'm glad that we did, you know, and I think this is exactly what is needed. we can't be afraid to get these controversial topics out in the air. We can't be afraid to not discuss them. And we can disagree, but we can do that maturely, intellectually, and we can talk and work through a lot of the issues that we have. It's going to be my last question. Yes? Absolutely.
And it starts with us really, because we have a power that most people don't even recognize. Like, we have the ability to get an education and be able to have an educated discussion and do it in a way where no one needs to feel like they're insulted or maybe they're minimized. And that's why I want to say thank you, because it's forums like this that people need to see. That way they can, appreciate that you'll have one side and you have the other side, but even they can find peace with each other.
Right. There's still that middle ground. And, like you said, we have a privilege that nobody recognizes. I mean, guys, journalists are getting murdered for having dissident voices. We can sit up here and be critical and say what we want without fear of without fear of death. Whereas other people do not have this luxury. And so using our voices and using our voices properly and for betterment, I think is so crucial. And especially in regards to this conflict, I'm hopeful that, the younger generation, people like us who have intermixed and intertwined and know each other, can sort of find that middle ground rather than just being pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. You can be pro both. So, thank you guys.